forest, and no one hears it. Does it make a sound? This philosophical question, or something like it, was posed in the 18th century by a bishop named George Berkeley. George wasn't really concerned with the nature of sound. He was arguing that the physical world doesn't really exist until we perceive it. We're not going to get into that. But the quote does raise a good question for us. At the most basic level, our job as live sound technicians is to take the sounds the performers make on stage and make them loud enough so everyone in the audience can hear them. In order to do that effectively, it's critical that we understand the characteristics of the sound we're amplifying. So what exactly is sound? Think about some things a performer might be doing on stage to create sound. They might be playing a guitar, or singing, or playing the drums. Each of these things sounds quite different from the others, but what do they have in common? Let's think about the performer playing the guitar. As he plucks the strings, what happens? Looking at this video, we can clearly see the strings vibrating. Likewise, when the singer tightens her vocal cords, the air passing between them causes them to vibrate. And when the drummer strikes a cymbal with a stick, the vibrations are impressive indeed. All sound originates with vibration. The dictionary describes sound as mechanical radiant energy that is transmitted by longitudinal pressure waves in a material medium, such as air, and is the objective cause of hearing. So there's more to it than vibration. The vibration creates energy that is transmitted through the air and is sensed by the audience's ears. It does this by creating waves that travel through the molecules of air. Okay, so each of the performers and instruments are creating waves, but why do they all sound so different? Here's a graphical depiction of a simple wave called a sine wave due to its shape, which is the same as the sine function in trigonometry. The shape of a wave is one of the things that can vary, but there are others, and they each have an impact on the sound. Let's talk about the characteristics of sound waves and how we perceive them. Here's our sine wave again. You can see that there are peaks and valleys at regular intervals. The interval from one peak of a wave to the next is called the period. For sound waves, it's more commonly referred to as a cycle. In this case, each cycle takes 1/10 of a second. That means there will be 10 cycles in a second. This is called the frequency of the sound wave, and 1 cycle per second is called a hertz, named after a scientist called Heinrich Hertz. So we would describe this sine wave as having a frequency of 10 hertz. How does a wave's frequency affect the sound we perceive? Here's a 50 hertz sine wave, representing 50 vibration cycles per second. Let's take a listen. Now here's a 1000 hertz sine wave. It's difficult to even see the individual cycles. Let's listen to this one. As you can hear, the higher the number of cycles per second, the higher pitched the sound is. So frequency determines pitch. The theoretical range of hearing for a human is from 20 hertz on the low end to 20,000 hertz on the high end. Listen as we sweep through that range with a sine wave. You probably couldn't even hear the low and high ends of the range. There are a couple of reasons for that. First, the equipment you're listening on is probably unable to reproduce the lowest and highest pitches. Even if it could, as we age, we lose the top and bottom of our hearing range due to physical changes and damage caused by loud noises. If you're old enough to understand this video, it's unlikely you've retained the ability to hear the whole range. Dogs can perceive frequencies up to 40,000 hertz. So if you have a dog with you, you may have gotten a reaction to that sound. Let's talk about another characteristic of sound waves. Here's our 10 hertz sine wave again. We can measure the distance between the center line, which is the point where whatever is vibrating returns to its resting position before moving in the other direction, and the peak, which is where the vibrating object reaches its maximum excursion from its resting position before heading back again. This distance is called the amplitude. Amplitudes can vary. Picture a guitar string. If it's plucked lightly, it'll only travel a short distance from its resting position before it returns back, and the sound wave it generates will have a low amplitude. If it's plucked harder, the string will travel farther from its resting position as it oscillates back and forth, and the wave it generates will have a higher amplitude. How will our ears perceive that difference? The guitar string plucked harder will be louder, so the amplitude of a sound wave affects the loudness of a perceived sound. The perceived loudness of a sound is measured in decibels, abbreviated as small d, capital B. The way we perceive loudness is a little complex. If there was a direct relationship between the energy generated by a sound wave and the way we perceive it, doubling the power of a sound would double the loudness of a sound. But that's not how it works. Power versus loudness is a logarithmic function, so when the power of a sound doubles, the amount of change in loudness we hear depends on how loud the sound was to begin with. We don't really need to understand the mathematics and physics behind all this, but here's an important thing to remember. The minimum change in loudness that most people can perceive is about 3 decibels. So if someone asks you to turn it up or down just a little, try 3 decibels. To complicate things a little more, humans don't perceive loudness the same across the entire frequency range. Our ears are much more sensitive to sounds in the 1,000 to 5,000 hertz frequency range than they are to lower or higher sounds. Why would that be? Well, that's the range of the human voice. So we've evolved to be able to detect a voice even if there are other equally loud sounds present. Interestingly, we are most sensitive to sounds between 2,000 hertz and 4,000 hertz, and the typical frequency of a baby's cry is right around 3,000 hertz. Understanding the relationship between sound frequency and hearing sensitivity is important, and we'll address some practical considerations later. But for now, let's talk about another characteristic of sound waves. Let's say we have a piano player, a guitar player, and a trumpet player, all playing the same note at the same loudness. They'll sound identical, right? It's easy to hear that the sounds are coming from different instruments. But why? What characteristic of sound waves enables us to distinguish one from the other? Let's look again at our sine wave. You can see how the amplitude ramps up and down smoothly. But what if it didn't? Here's another simple wave called a square wave. As you can see, the amplitude of a square wave goes straight up to its maximum height, stays at that height for the period of the wave, then goes straight back down again to its maximum excursion in the other direction. Here's another simple wave called a triangle wave. In this wave, the amplitude goes up in a straight line ramp to its maximum height, then goes immediately down at the same angle until it reaches its maximum excursion in the other direction. Here's one more simple wave called a sawtooth wave. In this wave, the amplitude goes up in a straight line ramp to its maximum height, then goes straight down to its maximum excursion in the other direction. So what do they sound like? Here's a 1,000 hertz sine wave, a 1,000 hertz square wave, a 1,000 hertz triangle wave, and finally a 1,000 hertz sawtooth wave. Same frequency, same amplitude, but different sound due to their wave shapes. The way we perceive differences between sounds caused by different wave shapes is called timbre. One thing you probably noticed about all these wave shapes is that they sound electronic. That's because simple wave shapes like this can only be created electronically. There are some instruments that sound similar. A flute sounds a little like a sine wave, and a clarinet sounds a little like a square wave, but naturally produced sounds are much more complex than simple waves produced by synthesis. Here's a representation of a sine wave compared to waves of the same frequency produced by a guitar and a piano. What causes this complexity? Let's consider the piano. When a key is pressed, a hammer strikes the corresponding string, causing it to vibrate. But that string is not the only thing vibrating. The string is attached to a metal frame, which also vibrates. The metal frame is attached to the wooden piano case, which vibrates as well. In addition, all of the other strings in the piano vibrate sympathetically with the original string. The wave that's produced is a combination of all these vibrations, and our ears detect the distinct timbre of that piano. I say that piano because no two pianos, or guitars, or voices sound exactly alike. Okay. We've covered three characteristics of sound waves and sound: frequency, perceived as pitch; amplitude, perceived as loudness; and wave shape, perceived as timbre. There's one more characteristic we need to be concerned about. Take a look at this sine wave. Now look at this one. They look the same, although it appears that the wave is moving. Here's a picture of the two waves, one on top of the other. Actually, what's happening is that the peaks and valleys have changed position. Let's look at the way a loudspeaker works. A wave of electrical energy passes through its voice coil. The wave is alternating current, alternating between positive and negative. When the current is positive, it pushes the speaker out. When it's negative, it pulls the speaker back. This vibration causes a sound wave that travels through the air to our ears. So far, so good. What if we reverse the wires attached to the speaker? Now, when the current is positive, it pulls the speaker back, and when it's negative, it pushes the speaker forward. We call this reversing the speaker's polarity. Reversing a polarity doesn't affect the sound at all, as long as the sound is only coming from one source. But what if we have two speakers reproducing the same sound, as is common in live sound systems? As long as both speakers are pushing out or pulling in at the same time, all is well. But if the polarity is reversed on one speaker, the speakers are said to be out of phase with one another, and the sound will be negatively affected. Phase problems can result from wiring issues. They can also be caused by sound waves bouncing off walls and interfering with the original waves, and by using two microphones on one sound source. We'll talk about all of these later because they are common problems that we need to be able to diagnose and compensate for. But sometimes we can use phase to improve our sound by compensating for other issues. We'll discuss that in the next unit. So, there are four characteristics of sound waves which affect the ultimate sound that we need to remember: frequency, perceived as pitch; amplitude, perceived as loudness; wave shape, perceived as timbre; and polarity, perceived as phase. Next, we'll talk about the sound reinforcement chain and how the components work together.